In this video, I'm going to give you guys the top 5 budget decks for the March 2023 competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Format. Let's jump into it. What's up, Ocean? You got Matt here, and welcome to another top 5 Yu-Gi-Oh! Discussion video. Today, we're covering the top 5 best budget decks for March 2023 format. I have a ton of really solid options for you guys today, all within the around $50 price range, which is kind of crazy because most of these videos that I see are around $100 to $150, and to me, that's not really budget. So we're gonna go ahead and talk about all these decks at under $50. The assumption that I'm making for this is that you're brand new to the game. Most newer players don't have the budget that older, more experienced players have to invest their time and hard-earned money into the game. So I want to make sure that you're getting the most bang for your buck by getting a really solid competitive deck for this format at a really good price. If you're excited for the video, then do me a favor and smash the like button, guys, and of course subscribe to the channel as well. We're a brand new channel, but this is just the beginning, so make sure to sub to the channel to say that you've been here from the start. Also, make sure to comment which budget decks I missed out on this list. Now, before I talk about the 5 best budget decks in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh!, what makes a good Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck in the March 2023 format? Well, the main thing is going to be that after the banning of Kid Kalos and the nerfing of tier limits, the main thing is going to be you have to have a way to handle the Kashtira metagame. These cards are just so strong, and an end board of Kashtira Shangri-Ira and Kashtira Arise Heart can be the absolute death of you if you don't know how to play around it. Luckily, a lot of these decks I'm going to show you have a way around those threats. It's also important that you have a really small engine that has a really big impact. Think of something like Sword Soul, which has a really small engine but tons of ways to get to it, like Sword Soul Emergence, Moye, Incredible Ecclesia, Sword Soul Taya. There's a ton of different ways to be able to get into your endgame with Sword Soul, and because of that, you can play a lot of hand traps and board breakers. And that's my second thing here. You have to be able to have enough space to play hand traps and board breakers in this format, or else you're going to have a really hard time going second against a lot of these crazy decks. I also think an advantage goes to decks that can afford to play 2 copies of basically all of their important extra deck cards, and the reason for that is because you don't want to lose a key piece of your engine to Diabolosis the Mind Hacker. Losing something like a Kid Kalos in a previous format, if it would have been limited to 1, would have been devastating for tier limits deck. So you really want to make sure that you're maximizing as much as you can and taking care of these flex spots in your extra deck so that you can really handle the majority of the meta. Now, obviously, some decks are going to do well even though they have a much heavier engine, like Branded Despia or Branded Bestial or even Dragon Link, but those are really the exceptions, not really the rule here. Now, in no particular order, here are going to be the 5 best budget decks for March 2023 in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Starting off, for $30, you can go ahead and pick up 3 copies of the Beware of Traptrix structure deck. Now, everyone and their mother is making a guide on how to use Traptrix, and honestly, it's for good reason. It is not the best deck in the room by all means, but it is still a very competent and strong Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck because it does a lot of things that the meta just isn't really well prepared for. No one is playing back row removal, and a deck like Traptrix, which relies a lot on trap cards and Traptrix Sarah, is going to be putting a lot of work in because of that. Just in the structure deck, you pick up some amazing staples that can be used in other decks right away, something like Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, which is one of the best hand traps in the current format. Maybe arguably Nibiru and Infinite Impermanence are better, but these are some really strong hand traps. You have an amazing going second board breaking card in Evenly Match, which is crazy. You have Raigeki and Harpy's Feather Duster, which are amazing cards to have in the side deck as well. And for a very low cost, you can pick up 3 copies of Parallel Exceed, 3 copies of Compulsory Evacuation Device, 2 copies of Torrential Tribute, and you should be basically ready to go with this deck, at least for the main deck. As for your extra deck, you're going to pick up a few more cards, namely 2 copies of Time Thief Redoer, which is absolutely incredible because you play multiple different trap monsters in this deck, in Phantom Knights of Shade Brigandine and Traptrix Holutea, which can be activated, both of these, on your first turn, either by having no traps in grave for the case of Phantom Knights of Shade Brigandine, or by discarding a trap card for Traptrix Holutea. Obviously, this is really powerful because you get to take advantage of 2 of the effects of Time Thief Redoer right away. The effect to target a face-up card on the field by detaching a trap card is incredibly important, and you still get to tag out really easily because the majority of your deck here is going to be monsters. I definitely believe that Time Thief Redoer is one of the best non-Traptrix monsters that you can go into as a rank 4 for this strategy. I also think that Baguska, the Terribly Tired Tapir, is an amazing card to have access to in your extra deck. Just to be able to slow the game down a little bit can be really valuable, especially because you have access to all your defensive trap cards to protect Baguska until you're ready to make a big push with your Link monsters. I also think that Nightmare Unicorn has a lot of value as a good generic out to a lot of really weird threats by shuffling cards back into the deck, which is really strong in this format. This deck really has it all. It has a lot of flex spots, it has some interruptions in the form of Ash Blossom, Evenly Matched to be able to board break, has access to extenders in the form of Parallel Exceed, in the form of Traptrix Arachnocampa, as well as Traptrix Purika, which can actually search your field spell and give you an additional normal summon, which is all really valuable to have access to get into your Traptrix Sarah, followed by another activation of a Traptrix monster to set a trap card and then keep the ball rolling. When you activate a normal trap card, Sarah will then activate by special summoning a Traptrix monster from deck other than the ones you have on field, and it can be really just devastating to get the ball rolling and snowball over your opponent. One of the best trap cards to have in this format is going to be Floodgate Trap Hole. Having the ability to permanently Book of Moon one of your opponent's monsters is huge, especially against the Kashtira matchup. The fact that if your opponent goes to special summon something like a Unicorn or a Kashtira Fenrir, and you can permanently Book of Moon that, it is very valuable because they can't extend their plays at all. They can't search the Birth, they can't search the Unicorn, they can't search whatever they need to, and it really stops them from special summoning as well because they control a monster on their side of the field. If you want to go the extra mile and start upgrading this deck, you can go with something like a Solemn Judgment. This card is going to be getting a reprint in Maze of Memories being released pretty soon, which is really nice to have access to because it's an amazing going first card for the deck. You also have access to something like Nibiru the Primal Being, one of the best hand traps to stop the Kashtira board and other really crazy boards. Despia kind of doesn't play around it that well anymore, so having access to Nibiru is amazing. You also could look at something like Zeus, and I think Zeus has a lot of value in a deck that plays any XYZ, especially because you're able to send a really good portion of the Kashtira board away, which is very valuable. Infinite Impermanence is one of the best hand traps in the entire game, so make sure to pick up your place out of them once you can afford it. Also guys, a Book of Eclipse is really solid, and Dimensional Barrier are basically blowouts against the Kashtira or Despia matchup. Really solid options there. And lastly, this has room for growth by adding in the Therian package, which is really strong and powerful, but just pretty pricey. Basically, Therian Regulus kind of takes up our entire budget here, which is a little unfortunate, but you guys get the point. If you want to upgrade, there are ways to go about it. Next on the list though is going to be Naturia, and specifically Naturia Vernasil. This deck has gone a little bit less expensive now that the Ishizu cards and the Tier Elements matchup has really kind of gone away, and that's a good thing. I think that having access to a deck that plays really good starters like Naturia Mole Cricket, Naturia Camellia, cards like Naturia Sacred Tree for a good consistency card, Naturia Blessing as a Reborn or Fusion or Synchro Spell are all really good. Also, you have tons of ways to interrupt your opponent. It's a really small niche engine when you pair with something like 3 Ash Blossoms, 3 Effect Balers, 3 Book of Eclipse. You have a ton of options, as well as 3 Dark Ruler No Mores. I think there's a lot of value in having so many board breakers and so many hand traps in a deck like this that can still put up a ton of negates with the effects of Naturia Sunflower, Naturia Stinkbug for the effect to protect against battle damage and battles in general, and of course setting up amazing synchros like something like a Naturia Beast or something like a Sorcerer Sovereign Chenying, which is very incredibly powerful. Unfortunately, there's no structure deck for these cards to come in, so you do have to order them off something like TCG Player, but I do think that this deck is very inexpensive. The Vernasil cards really add an extra layer of dimension because everything you're really using is going to be Earth, and that's very valuable to be able to get extra bodies on board to perform Synchro Summons, XC Summons, and of course the really powerful Link Summons that this deck has available. I do think that the Vera, the Vernasil Goddess, is a little bit redundant, but the fact that it is a decent boss monster to be able to take control of opponents' cards is very valuable in a format like this. But as you get to the point where you're going to spend a bit more money on the deck, I think Vera becomes a little bit redundant and not that necessary, especially because most of the time you're going to be ending up going with something like Naturia Runic. It's just that cards like Runic Tip and Runic Fountain are pretty pricey right now, so it doesn't make much sense for you to start your Yu-Gi-Oh! Competitive journey by going and spending a ton of money on the fountains and tips that you may not even need for future decks. This deck really appreciates Earth Fairy monsters, and because of that, we're actually playing one each of the limited Keldo and Mudora, which are the shufflers of the Ishizu archetype, and they're really solid still in this format. If you're trying to shuffle something in like a Branded Fusion from your opponent's graveyard as they try to go for a Despian Tragedy line to set it back to their side of the field, it can give you an extra turn to survive and potentially OTK, which is really important. This deck has a ton of ways to get into Naturia Mole Cricket, which is the heart of the deck, including a copy of 1-for-1, which is so incredibly important. Having access to Mole Cricket is the heart and soul of what this deck does. Mole Cricket will eventually get you to 2 or even 1, well, 1, mostly 2 of your Naturia monsters and be able to get the ball rolling on your opponent's turn, which is really strong in a format like this. I do think that for the extra deck, you really want to look at cards like Naturia Barkion, Naturia Beast, because they're really easy to get into. I do believe that even though Abyss Dweller is not as good in this format as it was in last format, it definitely has a home in this deck, as well as something like Baguska, the Terribly Tired Tapir, which just so happens to be an Earth-type card, as well as Gagaga Cowboy, which is amazing because you can have now a win-in-time mechanic built into your extra deck for rank 4s that are pretty easy to go into, which is awesome. As for upgrades to the deck, I mentioned the runic cards, which are very valuable, but I do think that you want to look at upgrading your side deck here, specifically with cards like Lava Golem or Sphere Mode, which are very strong in the format today. Also, Nibiru, cards like Harpy's Feather Duster or Lightning Storm, and Evenly Matched Twin Twister and Infinite Impermanence all have a lot of value in the side deck. Now, is this the best Naturia deck there is? No, it's not, but for what the budget we're looking at is, it is definitely a very solid and strong deck in a competitive situation. If you're an experienced and confident Naturia player, you can definitely get the job done against a lot of really strong decks in this format. Next up, we're going to talk about Floowandereeze. The birds are back. Even though they lost Barrier Statue, it is a little unfortunate. I know the Advents of Adventure are a little bit out of our budget. Well, not a little bit, but really out of our budget. And Pots of Prosperities are also not going to be a thing. I do believe that Floowandereeze is a really strong budget deck because not everyone is really expecting it. Obviously, the deck still has consistency issues. It's not a perfect deck by any means, but you do definitely have a lot of ways to get to your little bursts like Eglin and Robina to be able to break through opposing boards and really set up an impossible way for your opponent to break through yours. So having access to 3 Robina, 3 Eglin is really nice. Having 3 Extravagance, which are very inexpensive because of the Albast structure deck, Pots of Duality are dirt cheap as well, are really good ways to be able to dig through your deck. If you want to add something like Upstart Goblin, you can as well, just be careful in time. I also think that because this deck has so many flex spots, you're able to play 3 copies of Book of Moon or Book of Eclipse, but I prefer in this deck Book of Moon, because you're able to allow you to dodge problematic hand traps like Effect Veiler or Infinite Impermanence on cards like Eglin or Robina, which can stop your turn dead in its tracks. So having access to Book of Moon is very valuable. For going second, cards like Dark Ruler No More are incredibly valuable, and hand traps like Effect Veiler and Ash Blossom are extremely important in a format today. The reason why I don't think you have to play Book of Eclipse in this format is because you have access to Floowandereeze and Snarl, which is basically just a walking Book of Eclipse, which is insanely good in this format, especially against Kashtira. You also have Floowandereeze and Dreaming Town, which is the trap card which will allow you to banish it from the graveyard to Book of Eclipse your opponent's entire board. Super valuable there as well. And one of the most underrated cards in the deck is going to be Floowandereeze and the Unexplored Winds, allowing you to tribute your opponent's cards, not monsters, cards. This can be really good against problematic Floodgate decks, so keep that in mind. And finally, Magnificent Map. This is a really strong field spell that is dirt cheap because of the Megatins. This entire deck is very inexpensive because of the Megatins. This deck is very inexpensive, and the most expensive cards you're going to have is going to be maybe the Extravagances or maybe the Ash Blossoms, maybe the Ryza. It's a very cheap deck all around that can put up a ton of negates, can break going second as well with Ryza, and has access to an insane pseudo Floodgate card in Empen, which is really, really strong. The extra deck doesn't even matter for this deck. You can toss in any 15 cards that you want in this extra deck to be able to just do whatever you want with them, because most of the time you're going to banish them off of Extravagance. So it really doesn't matter too much. I will say though that if you want to invest in it, cards like the Charmers, Dark, Asa, cards like Area, Lina, what else is there? There is, oh my god, I'm blanking on the other cards. Win is there, and Hitza. The 6 Charmers are all really, really strong here to have access to just for niche situations, as well as Relinquish Anima and Silent Moongrade Almirage to be able to get you into those Charmers on different bridges, which are very, very valuable. Cards like the Nightmares like Phoenix, Cerberus, and Unicorn are all incredibly important. Link Spider is fine, and Donner Dagger for Hire is a really solid low investment Link 2 that could out problematic situations. And then finally, if you get in the situation where you want to overlay 2 Floowandereeze and Empens, you can go with something like Super Dreadnought Rail Cannon and Gustav Max and Juggernaut Lieb, which are all really solid options to be able to end the game pretty quickly, which the deck kind of struggles to do a little bit. There are 2 real ways to boost the power of this deck, and the first of which is to get a copy or 2 or 3 of Floowandereeze and the Advent of Adventure. This card is incredibly important. It's essentially the Rhoda for the archetype, while also being able to protect against effect negation and also being able to extend your plays further, which is incredibly important in this deck. They're just pretty pricey right now. I also think that getting Pots of Prosperity are really good because you then get to kind of keep which cards you want in your extra deck, which has value, and pick and choose which of the top 6 cards you really want to get. If your Robina is the 5th card down, you'll be able to get it by banishing 6 cards from your extra deck. Instead of with Pot of Extravagance, you banish 6, you draw 2, you may not get to that 5th card there, which is again very important. I also think that cards like Imperm and Nibiru have a lot of value. Cards like Dimension Shifter are not as good in this format, but definitely will have their place in upcoming formats. And finally, I think that really important, if you can get access to a Zeus package for this deck, with a copy of the Lyrilusc Assembled Nightingale, which can attack directly, overlay into a card like Downer Magician, and then go into Zeus, you can have a 2 usage Zeus. Format Zeus is really, really strong here, so I definitely recommend looking into that to upgrade your Floowandereeze deck. As for the 4th deck on the list, we're going to be looking at Ignister. Now, obviously, this could be a lot of different Link decks, the Cybers decks that are out there. We're going to be looking at basically a combination of Ignister and using Mathmech as like an extender situation, which I think is really good. A lot of these decks that are the Cybers decks have the ability to play so many different flex spots because they're basically just 1-card starters. And this is going to be the first time I'm going to show you the Kaijus in the list. This list here is really solid, I find, and it's a very inexpensive list as well. You got 3 copies of Pikari at Ignister and a Chi-Chi at Ignister, which are your main starter pieces, as well as Doyons, Barurus, Hiyari is good, Denmari, and Gachiri, all of which have a lot of value as different 1-ofs or 2-ofs in the strategy. I do think that having access to Mathmech Circular in addition to Mathmech Sigma and Addition, see what I did there, is really valuable as well to extend your plays even further. It has a lot of consistency cards with I Meet You, and of course Psynet Mining, has Reborns in the archetype in terms of Fighting Spirit, and of course Idle Reborn as well. But the main valuable piece of this puzzle here is going to be Ignister Island. This card, this field spell, is what makes the deck tick. And unfortunately, if this card gets removed from the field, then your combo kind of ends, which is a bit of a problem. That's why it's not seeing as much play. But the reason why I like this deck so much in this format isn't because of all the space it has. It's because it ends on the Arrival Cyberse at Ignister, which is basically an impossible card to beat. This card is incredibly powerful that can get to easily 5,000-6,000 attack and close out a game very quickly because it can't be affected by other cards' effects. So the only way to really deal with it is going to be with a Kaiju, a Lava Golem, or a Spear Mode. Those are basically the main issues. The problem is, a lot of the time you'll end up with one card on field, being the Arrival Cyberse at Ignister, so the only real out to it are going to be Kaijus. And right now, most people are playing Lava Golem and Spear Mode instead of access to a Kaiju. So you may just have access to a auto win button on your turn here, which is insane to think about. I do recommend that you play 2 of them. It is dirt cheap, this card, so play 2 of them in case your opponent goes for like a way to banish it from your extra deck. If they do that, and you only have 1, well, you basically lose the game unless you can get into really other like transcode OTK stuff. I do think that you have to play 2 copies of the Dark Infinite at Ignister. This is one of the best link ones available. It basically searches your field spell, extends a bit. It's a really solid card and gets you access to a different typing or different attribute rather for your Arrival Cyberse at Ignister. You need cards like Splashmate, Deco Talker, Heat Soul, cards like Dark Templar at Ignister. Lingeribo is very good in this deck. It's extremely good in this deck because of the Ibly Lock and it's a Cyberse card. Also, cards like Cyberse Wicked are very valuable and Splashmate for extension. And then you have access to cards like Prime Mathmech, Alimbertion, which can get you any spell card in the game, which is really good for certain situations. I also believe that cards like Wind Pegasus at Ignister are really strong for certain situations because you do end up syncing a little bit with your Bururu, which is a tuner monster here. In general, this deck is really strong, it's really consistent, and it does a lot of good things really well because you can play so many hand traps and you do have access to Kaijus. Right now, you don't want to play the rank 7 ones. I know I have access to Kumungus in this deck over here, but the reason I have it is just to show you that you have options. But right now, you want to stick to your level 8 Kaijus, like your Gamma Seals specifically. Those are the best ones right now because they don't really have any synergy with anything like in the previous formats. Good Darla is not as necessary anymore, so having access to Kaijus are very strong. In order to upgrade this deck to the best it could possibly be though, you have to get Access Code Talker. This card is expensive. It's like 40 bucks right now at the time of recording, which is insane to think about. It's come down a lot, which is good, but having access to Access Code Talker, which is majority of your budget right now, is a big deal to be able to break through boards and OTK out of nowhere if your line into the Arrival Cyberse card has kind of been stopped. So keep that in mind when you're going for it. Again, cards like Imperm are going to be better than cards like Effect Veiler. Cards like Nibiru might be better than the Kaijus or the Dark Rulers that you have in the main. Switch those around, and of course you want to get cards like Evenly Match, Lightning Storm, and Dimensional Barrier rather, which are very strong in different formats. Harpy's Feather Duster and Twin Twister for back row, and you should be good to go. I like this deck a lot. It's one of my favorite decks to get me back into the game, so I definitely want to recommend it to you guys as well. And then finally, one of my favorite decks of the new format is going to be Plunder Patrol. One piece the deck is here. This deck is so much fun. It has a little bit of a consistency issue because we're not playing the adventure engine and we can't really afford that right now, but it still is a very good deck in a budget perspective because you have so many different options here. You're going to be playing 3 of most of the Plunder cards. I think the only one you really don't play 3 of is going to be Redbeard, 2 max, maybe even 1 depending on your build, but Shipyard is an amazing card to have, an amazing field spell. You have access to a lot of different flex spots in your deck. Your engine is very small and compact, which is really strong here. Also, you have ways to be able to main cards like Book of Eclipse, like a Dimension Barrier, like Interrupted Kaiju Slumber if you want to be just going blind second. It's really strong. And then one of the best cards in this format here is going to be Enemy Controller, and it pairs really well with the Plunder cards because they get their bonus effects when you tribute them off to be able to take control of your opponent's monster. So whether it's going to be something like Whitebeard to special summon from deck or something like Bluebeard to discard 1 and draw 1, those can be really valuable in different formats. I also think that the extra deck is so nice. You have a couple ways you can go with it, but what you definitely want to do is 3 copies of the Blackbeard, the Plunder Patrol Captain, 2 copies of each of the other ships, Merc, Bran, Lys, and the new one, Jord, or Yord, however you want to pronounce it. At the end of the day, this deck is so good, and Jord, Yord, whatever, does so many good things for the strategy. The fact that you can get into basically any of your Plunder ships in turn 1 is so valuable. If you want that monster negate, you can go into Lys. If you want the attack boost, you can go into Bran. If you want access to banishment of spell, Bran as well. And then Merc could be really strong as well to be able to banish an effect monster that your opponent controls as well. As for the other spots you have 11 spots taken up already just for engine in your extra deck. Well, now we can look at cards that are going to do very niche things. Something like Salmon Great Almarash is a kind of a must in this deck to be able to get a 1-card combo with something like your Golden Hair, which is very valuable. Also, Something like Dawn or Dagger for Hire has a lot of unique niches and value. It's not the best card to have access to, but it's very inexpensive and can get the job done. And I do think that the Bahamut Shark plus Totally Awesome combo makes a lot of sense. All of the cards in your main deck that are basically summoned out are waters. So you can get into Bahamut Shark and then go into Toad, and you can get the ball rolling that way, have a negate as well as your plunder cards on the field as well. So very strong options here. I do think this deck makes a lot of sense going first or second, and I do think it's one of my favorite decks to play in this new format. It does really well against a lot of different strategies, and I'm so happy about that because it is an amazingly fun deck to play. Now, to improve the deck, I definitely would go with something like Impermanence and access to Nibiru over the Kaiju package, maybe even over something like the Mind Control and the Change of Heart that I have showing here. But most of the time you have already what you need in the main deck, which is incredible. You just switch it out for different matchups for whatever your locals would be showing, and you go from there. And of course, to bring the most out of the deck, you want to get access to your 3 Rite of Amarysir, your 3 Water Enchantress, your Faithful Adventure, your Dracoback, and of course your Wandering Griffin Rider to give you that extra negate on the field, which is very valuable. And then I do think that this deck, because you kind of need your normal summon, it doesn't make much sense to play Lava Golem. I know I'd have it on the screen, but Lava Golem won't necessarily be the best option for you in a format like this, for this deck that kind of relies a bit on its normal summon, but rely on something like the Kaijus or even Sphere Mode instead. And that's it, guys. That's my top 5 budget decks for the March 2023 competitive Yu-Gi-Oh format. If you guys enjoyed this video, then do me a favor and smash the like button, guys. And of course, comment which deck is your favorite of the bunch and which budget deck did I miss out on this video. Make sure to let me know down in the comments. And of course, subscribe to the channel as well for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.